Hello, in this video I'm going to take you through part 2 of the Cambridge Proficiency Listening Test. What do you have to do in part 2? Well, in part 2 you have a sentence completion task and you'll be listening to a single person speak. In other words, it's a monologue. Sentence completion involves listening to that speaker, reading sentences with gaps in them and picking out the correct information from the recording to put in the gap. There are 9 questions here, with a total of 9 marks, 1 mark per question, and 9 marks out of 30 makes this a fairly substantial part of the overall paper. Let's have a look at some sample instructions and example questions as well. So as with the other parts of the listening exam, you'll be given a context first. So in this case, you'll hear a journalist reporting on a scientific expedition to a volcano, and you'll need to complete the sentences with a word or a short phrase. The kinds of sentences that you could be given are shown below. These are examples. It's important to notice that it is a word or a short phrase, so you may need to write 1 word in the gap, but it could equally be a phrase of 2 or 3 words. Also important to know is that you will hear the answers in order. So in other words, you'll always hear the answer to gap 7 before you hear the answer to gap 8. You'll have 45 seconds to read the sentences before you listen to the recording, and in a moment I'll give you some suggestions on ways that you can exploit that time effectively. You'll hear the word or short phrase exactly as it needs to be written. However, the surrounding sentence will not be the same as what you see on the answer sheet. So in other words, if you look at the sentence containing gap 7, when you're listening to the recording, you're listening for the exact phrase that you hear, but you can't expect to hear the sentence that's written on the answer sheet. The sentence that's on the answer sheet will be paraphrased in the recording itself. So some tips on how to complete this section. Well, first of all, before you listen, make sure you read all of the sentences to give you an overview of the text structure. For example, if we look at the sentences that are given here on screen, we can see that these are to do with the preparation period before the expedition takes place. And as the recording progresses, the information then goes on to deal with the expedition when it's actually underway. And so that helps us to orient ourselves and have an idea of what to expect at each stage. The other thing that's really important to do here is to predict what kind of information you'll need in each of the gaps. So for example, if we look at gap 7, the information after that is that the journalist comments on who made up the majority of the expedition team. So we know that we need a noun in this gap and probably some kind of profession. So it's an animate noun, then we can ask ourselves, who might go on an expedition? Scientists would be an obvious choice, but there may be other options possible as well. If we then look at the gap for question 8, we know that something was grown in the jungle, and it was to provide for the team. So something was grown, a plant, and it was probably edible because it needed to provide for the team. So probably we're listening for some sort of crop here, some kind of vegetable. We also see that it's were grown as opposed to was grown, and that tells us that we're listening out for a plural noun specifically. Okay, let's put these strategies to work then. So in the actual exam, of course, you'll be listening. In this case, I'm going to give you the tape script on screen. So here is the tape script with the relevant information for gap 7. At this point, pause the recording, read the tape script, see if you can find the correct answer, and once you've done that, restart the recording. All right. If we have a look then, there are several words which might fit the gap. Scientists was our first guess, before we heard the recording, of course. We also hear biologists and naturalists, but actually all 3 of these are distractors. In other words, they are put in deliberately as alternative choices which are not correct. So you have to try and filter those out carefully and listen to the surrounding context well. The reason they're wrong is that if we listen further, it's the TV crew that was filming the documentary series around the expedition. They outnumbered all of the other people. So in other words, they made up the majority of the expedition team, and that means that TV crew in this case is the correct answer. Okay, let's try the same for gap 8. So here is the relevant part of the transcript. Pause the recording, find the correct answer, and then restart the recording when you're finished. Okay, so in this case, we hear sweet potatoes fairly early on. Another crop is mentioned later, rice, and there are some other options which don't fill the gap particularly well, but might be chosen by some candidates, such as canned food or harvested yield. So these are also distractors. Only sweet potatoes fills the gap, of course, because we're looking for a plural noun, which sweet potatoes is. Rice is singular, and so that wouldn't fill the gap. Okay, of course, the other reason that rice is incorrect is because the rice would have to be flown there, and that's the reason why sweet potatoes are being grown in the jungle. Okay, sweet potatoes then is the answer. Notice that potatoes on its own would not be correct, and that's because that is not the full noun. So if you wrote only potatoes in this case, that would not get the mark. So some tips for part 2. First of all, use the sentences to identify the structure of the text. This will help you to predict what you need to write. Check what kind of information is needed to fill the gap in each case. Think about grammatical categories as well. Beware of distractors, so watch out for any information which has been put in the recording to mislead you. And check afterwards, do a final check to make sure the information that you've written fits the gap completely. For example, if we go back to gap 7 and we wrote the TV crew, that would not be correct and the mark would not be given. And the reason for that is that the article the is already given within the sentence. So only TV crew would be correct and get the mark here. So do a final check to make sure that the information really does fit. Okay. That was part 2 of the CPE listening, so thanks for watching.